Pittsburgh Steelers have given fans a lot of reasons to be excited with their drafting and their setting things up in the offseason. But are we overlooking potentially one of the better parts of the team that we already knew was great and might even be in a better position because of how they've handled this offseason? That's the defensive line. We'll talk about that and take some of your questions here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things in the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find this show on your favorite podcasting app and especially on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy this show and if you enjoy this episode, and subscribe to this channel to get all of our daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. We thank you for making the Locked On Steelers podcast your first listen every day because we're your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Make every moment more by visiting FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. We'll get to more of that later, but hope everyone had a great weekend. We are here in May and OTAs start this week. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, the Steelers are holding their practices where we'll get to see the guys, all the team finally coming back together and us getting a chance to talk to them about their offseason. We'll get to that later. I still want to talk about something that I think has been overlooked as we have talked about all the things that have happened this offseason. The strengthening of the offensive line, not just with Broderick Jones and Isaac Seumalo, the potential stepping up of Kenny Pickett in the offense, and Darnell Washington and Pat Freiermuth and Zach Gentry as a tight end group, and Joey Porter Jr. along with Patrick Peterson, what the corners could look like. There's a lot of excitement there. But I think one thing we may be not hyping or harping on enough is the Steelers' defensive line, which last year was a vital part of the Steelers' success. And you're getting basically the same starters back from last year with Cam Heyward and Larry Ogunjobi of two of your inside pieces. But one of the biggest things that were the concerns for the Steelers, even going back to the start of last year and maybe even kind of the year before that when we didn't know, I guess the year before that, we didn't know that Stephon Tuitt's career was done. But once Stephon Tuitt announced his retirement, it was an immediate concern to find who were going to be the next guys at the defensive line. We knew last year when they drafted DeMarvin Leal, there were some things we liked about him, and then he showed a pretty decent rookie season when he wasn't injured. And then they went and drafted Keeanu Benton, who I had, if you followed this show throughout the draft process, leading up to the draft in the months in, I had as one of my top defensive linemen, even over guys like Mozzie Smith who went in the first round. And they got him in the second round at 49. And now they have a situation where their defensive line sets up to be still your top two guys, Cam Heyward and Larry Ogunjobi, your top two guys from last year. And now your next two guys can be the young guys that you're hoping will take the torch from the old guys in a few years. And that's DeMarvin Leal and Keeanu Benton. And you still have veterans that you've brought in, like Armon Watts, like Braden Fehoko, and you still have Montravius Adams to kind of fill out the bottom of the list. There's also Isaiah Loudermilk still around. But now you're in a position where last year, after those top guys, you had Chris Wormley, you had Tyson Alulu, who was on the last legs of his career. You weren't so sure about the depth at defensive line. This year, there's a lot more reasons to be excited. And I think this goes to when we talk about the entire Steelers roster. They have filled in so many more holes. You're so much more excited about different guys stepping up. Keeanu Benton, when you looked at his time in college, he had like six and a half, I think, sacks in his final year at Wisconsin, but he's still more of a run stuffer, and he's developing his skills as a pass rusher. But that's just fine, I think, for what the Steelers are right now. If you go and look at the rated, how many times players were charged with a hurry last year from Pro Football Focus when it came to the Steelers defenders. Of the top 7 guys who created the most hurries on quarterbacks and pass rushing, 5 of them were defensive linemen. 4 of them were defensive linemen. Cam Heyward was number 1 with 36 hurries, Behind him was Alex Highsmith with 35 and TJ Watt with 20. But then behind him were Larry Ogunjobi, Chris Wormley, and then Robert Spillane had the sixth most, and then Tyson Alulu was next. And Wormley and Alulu, Wormley, I think, was a solid occasional pass rusher who could occasionally win some one-on-one matchups. But he wasn't the guy that was going to consistently take on double teams, be a more physical player. He didn't have as much flexibility as a player who projects to be like DeMarvin Leal. There were things there that you wanted to be better. And Tyson Alulu, back, I think, a few years ago, before his most recent injury, Tyson Alulu was that guy. He was a great depth piece and even a starter if you wanted a nose tackle. But he aged out of that. Things happen. He was a good veteran for a time, and they need someone else to step up there. That's why I think they went and got Braden Fehoko and Armand Watts in the offseason just to say, hey, here's two veterans. They'll come in. They'll compete. We'll see how they do. But you have two young guys, especially that you drafted on the second day of the draft in back-to-back years. DeMarvin Leal is a third-round pick in 2022, and now Keeanu Benton is a second-round pick in 2023. And Benton, to me, could even be a starter at nose right now with you just say, hey, clog up holes, take on double teams. Don't let our linebackers get hit in the middle of the field. Keep the line clean. Keep the linebackers clean so that they can make plays against the run. And if they run your way, use them long arms, use that big body, take the play out. And if you look at where a lot of the success in stuffing the run last year came from, again, it was the defensive line. You go to Pro Football Focus, the most run stuffs went to Kent. Run stuffs or plays considered stops against the run by Pro Football Focus. 31 of them, the most on the team, was to Cam Heyward. Next up was Ogunjobi with 21. Devin Bush was next with 20, and Alex Highsmith and Miles Jack came after that. But then Chris Wormley was there. And I think, again, you're probably going to have Heyward and Ogunjobi there. But now you're hoping to have DeMarvin Leal for the whole season, and maybe he'll eke his way up into that. You'll also have Keeanu Benton playing, and I think that's where his strength is going to be. And you don't need Benton to necessarily be a premier pass rusher right away, because the Steelers are going to get that pass rushing from Heyward, from Ogunjobi. You're also going to get it from your edge rushers, who we know everyone's excited to see fully healthy for a year, TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith. And the Steelers are still going to be throwing their different blitzes, and we're probably going to see different ways to create pressure. But there's not as much pressure from these two guys, the younger defensive linemen, Leal and Benton, to be able to be the guys who create the most havoc. They can develop, and that's where I think the Steelers are in an advantageous situation on their defensive line right now. It's not just that they have the really good starters. They may have the future already on this roster at this position, which was something that was a concern for the past couple years. Who would be those guys? Can they find those guys? Because whereas you're confident Cam Heyward can do it, and you were happy with the Larry Ogunjobi signing last year, you know that though the time for that isn't, these guys aren't in the prime of their primes anymore. I think that Cam Heyward is still going to be a Pro Bowl player this year and still going to be a dangerous guy. I think Larry Ogunjobi has some really good years ahead of him. But you know that they are not in their mid-20s. You can't bank on them like you're banking on TJ Watt and Minkah Fitzpatrick and other guys who are veterans, but much into the prime of their career, where they have several years ahead of them to be these top players. These guys probably only got a few of those left. And last year, behind them, DeMarvin Leal was there when he was playing. It looked good. But then he got hurt, and you saw the depth of the defensive line take a hit. You saw it hurt the run defense at times. You saw it hurt the pass rush at times, and they couldn't generate much of a pass rush when TJ Watt was out. But now this year, I do think you're looking at a unit that could get back to being one of the best in the NFL, which is where it was in 2019 and even in 2020. Stephon Tuitt was a big part of that defensive line. I think that's something that Steelers fans forget, that his absence in the past few years is a huge hole in this roster. He was signed big money for him and Cam Heyward to be two colossal just powerhouses in the middle of the defense that could cause havoc in the run and the pass and make life easier for everybody else. And when Tuitt went down, they still had Heyward, but it wasn't the same. And that was something that Stephon Tuitt's contract finally just got off the books. And another reason why they're able to spend a little bit more money. And I truly think that with the drafting of Benton, the development of Leal, the keeping of Ogunjobi, and the consistent presence that Cam Heyward is there, as well as, your option for depth guys on that defensive line, the Steelers might be back to having not just a strong first wave of a defensive line. They may have the rotation to tire you out the same way Andy Weidel tried to help Howie Roseman's the GM of the Philadelphia Eagles, set up the Eagles defensive front with a consistent wave of defensive linemen who could create pressure, get in your face, be physical, and stay fresh all game long, so that eventually when it's crunch time in the fourth quarter, your starters are rested because you were able to trust some of those younger players to win some of those matchups. I really think that this is something that we haven't talked about enough, and that when the pads come on in August and we start seeing it in training camp, I'll be really eager to see how these guys line up against the Steelers offensive line and some of the battles we'll see when we start to see those one-on-ones, because the trenches are going to be a very important part of the Steelers season this year. We'll get to more questions. We'll get to more things here. We got some questions from you callers here on the Locked On Steelers podcast that we'll get to in just a minute here. So stick with us. We still have a lot to talk about on today's episode. But before we do any of that, I want to talk to you guys about our great sponsors at FanDuel. FanDuel, of course, is the #1 sportsbook in America. You need to get on it right now. If you haven't, you're missing out, because the NBA playoffs are in the conference finals, and it is crazy. It looks like the Denver Nuggets and the Miami Heat might be the ones going to the finals. But if you want to make money off it, there's no better place to do that than on FanDuel. Now, if you go to FanDuel and you're a new customer, you're in luck, because they have a new thing called what's called a no sweat first bet. If you make a bet on FanDuel as your first bet and you lose it, you can win back up to $1,000 in bonus bets if your bet doesn't win. Again, just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon and you can sign up today to claim your no sweat first bet. You can bet on how many points Jimmy Butler pulls off in the fourth quarter. You can bet on Nikola Jokic and if he's going to have another triple double. You can bet on who's going to win it all. All of that, though, that action can be done on FanDuel Sportsbook, the #1 sportsbook in America right now. It's all an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Don't miss your shot at a no-sweat first bet for up to $1,000 back in bonus bets on FanDuel today by going to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. Make every moment more with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We're continuing our show here on a Monday. Now, just a reminder for those who might be new to the show or might be coming back because they're excited about something. We've been doing our campaign where we're raising money for the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, where if you use the QR code on your screen, if you're watching on YouTube, or you use the link that's in the description of the podcast, whether it's in audio form or on YouTube, you can click on that link or use this QR code to go to my donation page and donate money to our cause to help raise money to help find a cure for cystic fibrosis, a condition that impacts tens of thousands of Americans every day. We appreciate any donation that you can. And if you are a person who likes to call in with questions, we have a lot of them. If you donate $10 and ask a question, we will be guaranteed your question answered on the air within a week of that donation. So thanks again to everyone who calls in at 412-223-6644. Let's actually get to one of those questions, because we have a lot of questions that have been piling up, and someone who recently donated got a question in, so I wanted to get them on the air. Here's Andrew from Plains, PA, asking a question that was sparked from an episode that we had last week.
Hello, Chris Carter. This is Andrew Szymanski from Plains, Pennsylvania, now a happy contributor to your good cause that you have on the show. But let's talk football. And I like what you brought up about the tight ends being cheaper options. But I am wondering, should we keep 2 tight ends? What do you think that will do to our wide receiver room? Who you see as long-term Steelers, and I would really love to hear what you have to say about that. Thank you. Love the show. Keep up the great work.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you for your donation to the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. Again, you can do that by going to the link, the QR code on screen, or using the link that's provided in the description of this podcast. But we appreciate you not only calling with a question, but donating to such a great cause that we're helping for here in the Locked On Steelers podcast. But let's get to answering Andrew's question. Now, for those who might have missed it, we had on NFL draft expert and host of Locked On NFL Scouting, Joe Marino, on the Wednesday Wednesday episode of last week. Joe was brought on because they recently, him and his partner Kyle Krabs did a review of the Steelers roster and the strengths, weaknesses, and what they thought the state of the Steelers was. And when we talked about it, he was very excited for what the potential could be with Pat Freiermuth and Darnell Washington moving forward. And he also talked about the longevity of it and what might be something in the works for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And that's that tight ends, when you look at the numbers in the NFL, do not get paid like top-tier receivers. And Pat Freiermuth is a guy who, in just 2 years in the NFL, has put up decent numbers with so-so quarterback play and has kind of been a guy who's shined. And if Kenny Pickett does take off and at least is a solid to above average quarterback in the next few years, you could see Pat Freiermuth's numbers take off and him get in the conversation with the top tight ends in the league. And that could be something exciting to see. And with the drafting of Darnell Washington, you could have another guy who, if he takes steps up with the offense, you could have multiple guys at the tight end position getting numbers. And what Joe Marino's point was, and this is to Andy's question, the Steelers, if they wanted to pay Pat Freiermuth and Darnell Washington, it would be a way of not having to pay wide receivers big money. Because if you look at the different positions in the NFL, wide receivers, the top guys are averaging like 30 million, 28 million. You know, if you'd have to go down 10, even like the 10 spots down, like guys like Diontae Johnson are averaging $18.3 million per year in how much they're making. Chris Godwin and Amari Cooper making $20 million a year. But switch that to tight end. The top guys at tight end, like Darren Waller, George Kittle, Travis Kelce. George Kittle's making an average of $17 million a year. Kittle, $15 million. Travis Kelce, $14.3. So you look at guys like that, and if you could sign Pat Freiermuth to a $13, $14, $15 million a year contract, and maybe you sign Darnell Washington if you wanted to keep both of them, let's say in the long run here, to maybe like another $8 million contract. That's how much. That's a little bit more than what Jonnu Smith is making for the Falcons. You could see a way to make to be paying your tight ends, have serious passing threats and blocking threats, and kind of keep doing what the Steelers have been doing at wide receiver, which is just drafting and not paying a bunch of guys. It seems to be the Steelers' model, especially in recent years, to mainly pay one big receiver and then draft around that guy and then develop how they are. That's what they're doing with Diontae Johnson now. He got a big payday, and Juju Smith-Schuster went elsewhere. James Washington went elsewhere, and now they've drafted guys like George Pickens, like Calvin Austin, other guys to fill in the roster here, and then they signed guys like Allen Robinson for smaller deals and see how it works. I can totally see, not to get to Andy's question here, I could totally see George Pickens being that guy. As long as he continues to rise, he had a really good rookie season. If he continues to take steps up in 3 years' time when his contract is up, I could totally see him being the guy that Diontae Johnson is now, money-wise, getting the big money contract, and the Steelers just keep drafting wide receivers early and trying to hit here and there so that they could still have a strong wide receiver core while only really paying one wide receiver. That was actually their plan with Antonio Brown. You go back to when he started with the Steelers, when he got his big contract, it was when Mike Wallace passed on his deal and went somewhere else. So Antonio Brown got paid in that situation. Then over the years, you think about the guys that they brought around him. They didn't pay Martavis Bryant big money to stick around. Marcus Wheaton didn't stick around. They kept drafting guys, and that's why the Steelers were drafting so many guys early, was to say, hey, we had that's that pillar piece in the wide receiver room. Now let's not overinvest in that position. Let's pay the number one guy in Antonio Brown, as he was for many years, and then let's invest in the position around him. So, Andy, I think you're absolutely on point here with what you're saying. The Steelers' plan is probably to pay one wide receiver and invest everywhere else, and draft here and try to put in guys here and there. But I truly think if you're looking for long-term Steelers, unless Diontae Johnson goes ballistic in the next few years, and I will say this, to be fair to Diontae Johnson, he's also not had the best quarterback play. You go back and you looked at the years that he's been on the team. He was drafted in 2019. That was the first year that Ben Roethlisberger missed the entire season, and he had to work with Mason Rudolph and Devlin Hodges. Then 2020, he had good Ben Roethlisberger for a little bit there, but then Ben Roethlisberger's knees kind of started to get weak, and he couldn't put up as many big numbers. And then in 2020, you had the old man version of Ben Roethlisberger, which was the worst version of him. He's still good, still good enough for them to make the playoffs, but still, that wasn't prime AB Ben Roethlisberger, mid 2010s when Ben Roethlisberger could throw back-to-back 6-touchdown type games and give him that chance. As Diontae Johnson, we have not seen him operate in an offense that's efficient in passing the ball, and we still may not this year. But still, I think it could be better. You think back to his best season, he had 1,100 yards and 8 touchdowns in 2021. Let's say Kenny Pickett takes a step forward and Diontae Johnson does get the chance to be a star. By the end of his contract, he should be 28 years old, I believe. When you look at him, the way he's paying out for the Steelers would have a choice then to say, hey, do you want to pay Diontae Johnson, to stick around, into his 30s, or do you want to pay George Pickens and see who's the bigger name wide receiver right there? I think that's a good problem to have, or not even necessarily a problem, but a good thing to have there for the Steelers. So to answer Andrew's question, I think George Pickens is your guy long-term, but I wouldn't be shocked if they paid Pat Freiermuth and he found a way. If Darnell Washington is the guy, if they found a way to keep him around, and because it was less expensive to do so, because also you have to remember by that time, if we're talking Pat Freiermuth times, we're also probably talking about what are they doing with Kenny Pickett? If Kenny Pickett has ascended to being one of the better quarterbacks in the NFL, his payday is going to be coming around the corner. So they're going to have to think of smart ways to spend their money, because then the benefit of having the rookie contract quarterback, those days are going to be over, and they're going to need to figure out how to spend smarter. So back to Joe Marino's point, could be that the tight end position could be the way to save money on that, and the Steelers just kind of stick to the plan of paying big money to one wide receiver and drafting around them so that they don't have to pay big money to multiple wide receivers there, while making maybe tight end a featured position on the roster. We got a few more questions here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Thanks again to Andy for the question and the donation to the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. We'll get to those questions and more here on the Locked On Steelers podcast in a bit. Don't go anywhere. I'm Chris Carter, your host. We'll be right back. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We're wrapping up the show here, but we want to get a few more of your questions in here. So let's go to this question that kind of got answered last week, but our friend Will from Hollidaysburg had a question about Mitch Trubisky, and I think it taps back into a conversation I had with Jenna Harner on the Friday episode, but we'll revisit it just for a second because Mitch Trubisky's extension is still kind of fresh in our minds because it happened late last week. Here's Will.
Good morning, Chris. This is Will from Hollidaysburg. I know I've kind of beat this issue to death, but I was hoping next time you and Ray are talking about the Steelers roster, Trubisky is going to be our number 2, even though we signed Mason. I personally like Mason a lot, but here's the problem I have that I wanted your opinion on. A team like Arizona last year, or somebody that loses their quarterback and needs an emergency mercenary kind of guy, someone's going to call Mitch's agent. He's still a starter in many books, and he could easily leave if he got a chance to start somewhere else. And I really think Omar should move him along when he has value, and keep Mason at number 2. And get that $8 million off the books. Just wondering if you looked at that angle about how he's viewed by the rest of the league and his chances of leaving suddenly. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. Now, I want everyone, before they jump down Will's throat, he made that call before Mitch Trubisky's extension. So there's a reason why he was talking about that different things. I think it's a much taller task for them to move him now. He's on a 3-year deal, but who knows? Maybe not. But when we look at what Mitch Trubisky is getting there, also Jerry Dulac from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette did some reporting, and we got some more numbers on the deal with Trubisky's 3-year deal, according to Jerry Dulac from my partner at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. He reported, he gets a 3-year deal worth $19.65 million. $8 million of that is guaranteed. Part of that is the guaranteed money that he already had on the books. With the $8 million comes a $6.92 million signing bonus, veteran minimum salary of $1.08 million in 2023, and basically he's going to be freeing up a little bit more money this year. So again, go check out Jerry Dulac's article on that in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. But in looking at the numbers there, I think the Steelers are in kind of a position where they can look at the books and say, okay, Mitch Trubisky signed a bit of an extension here. Now there's going to be a little bit more money freed up, and maybe they want to keep him around. So to answer Will's question, I do think the Steelers, they're never going to turn down a situation where if a team comes offering something that they'll just say no, get out of here, unless it's like, TJ Watt or a player that they're absolutely in love with. There's absolutely the chance that someone loses their quarterback in training camp, someone gets desperate and they're like, oh man, we need a veteran quarterback here. Pittsburgh, we like Mitch Trubisky. Let's work something out here. But again, I think the Steelers, paying Mitch Trubisky to stick around for a few more years shows they like him for that. And maybe Mason Rudolph could be the number 2 quarterback again in Pittsburgh. But I think with the new deal, it's just hard to see that happening unless someone comes in with like a 3rd round pick or something like that. And then you're like, okay, well, you know what? We'll part ways with our backup quarterback for that, because that can be a really good draft value. So to answer Will's question, I don't think it would happen unless someone came in offering something. And I think that would be a steep price for someone to pay. So I don't think it would happen. But hey, we've seen crazier things happen, like Chase Claypool going for the 1st overall pick of the 2nd round. But anyways, let's get to another question here. This is more of a scheduling question, which the schedule was released a few weeks ago, but I'm going to get to our friend RJ out in Michigan, who asked a question about when the Steelers might have a more convenient part of their schedule. Here's RJ.
Hey, Chris, this is RJ in Ishpeming, Michigan. A longtime listener. My question is, on the surface, what do you think is the easiest part of the Steelers' schedule this upcoming season? Depending on who you ask, everyone seems to have different responses, but I'm curious as to what, 3-4 game stretch you deem probably the easiest part of the schedule for the upcoming year. Appreciate it. Thanks, Chris. Bye.
Thank you, RJ, for your question here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Remember, if you want to ask a question, all you have to do is call 412-223-6644. Leave your name, where you're from, and keep your question under a minute. We'll try to get you on a show. And if you donate $10 to the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, your question will be answered within a week of your donation. We'll try to get that out as fast as possible. We do apologize to those who do call and sometimes don't get their calls on, because there's a lot of y'all that call all the time. But let's get to his question here. Let's pull up the schedule here on YouTube. So if you're watching, you can look at the schedule on your screen. If you're listening, I'll break things down a little bit here. I truly think what could end up really working for them schedule wise is they have a period right after the bye where they have an away game against the Rams and then 3 straight home games. That could be the time when the Steelers make a really strong push. Now, we got to see how they start the season, right? They start against the Niners, the Browns, the new look Browns, with Deshaun Watson, have a full year to kind of settle in. The Raiders on the road, the Texans on the road, the Ravens. If they come through that stretch 4-1, or even 3-2, I think they put themselves in a position with the stretch of the next 4 games after their bye week in week 6, where right after the bye, they're on the road Sunday afternoon against the Rams. Then right after that, they have they're back home against the Jaguars, 1 p.m. And then right after that, a Thursday night game against the Titans. But then after that, they get a long break to just have another home game against the Packers. Now, we talked when their schedule was released with Jenna Hunter about this 2 weeks ago, about how, yes, 2 Thursday night football games, that stinks. No one likes that. But the benefit could be the weeks after those games, you get kind of that longer week off. And if the Steelers can use that with their early week 6 bye to rest some guys, it might be the perfect time to be able to score some big wins. And you look at before and after both of their Thursday night football games, actually afters, the last one is an away game against the Colts, but these aren't matchups that terrify you this year. There's no Chiefs waiting for you right after Thursday night football. Thursday night football, again, the 4-game stretch that I think, to answer the question here from our friend RJ, is the Rams in week 7 on the road, then at home against the Jaguars in week 8, at home against the Titans in week 9, and then at home against the Packers in week 10. And then right after that, you're on the road in Cleveland. And again, who knows how Cleveland is going to be this year? I'm one of the people who just believe, I'm sorry, until they actually do it, I don't think the Browns are the thing to fear in the AFC. I know they got Deshaun Watson, Nick Chubb's still a beast, Myles Garrett's still a beast, but until that organization proves that they can put it together for more than half a season, I think that they're one of the more beatable teams in the AFC. And I think that that's a matchup that the Steelers, maybe not saying that they should be licking their chops at, but they can look at and say, you know what, that's just like everybody else. Just got to come and do your part, and you're going to win. That's kind of what the Steelers approach every game. They, when they talk about nameless gray faces, they mean it doesn't matter who they play. They have to do their job to beat their opponents. But that's the stretch that I look at could be the most beneficial for the Steelers, because you look at a lot of other parts of the schedule and there are some really challenging moments. You could look at and say, maybe the stretch of week 13 and week 14 at home against the Cardinals and then the Patriots, and then right after that you're on the road against the Colts. But that's bookended by an away trip in week 12 against the Bengals and a home game against the Bengals in week 16. So if you're looking for 4 weeks, that's a tough stretch there. But 13 through 15 could be a 3-game set for the Steelers to work out for them. But I think the sweet spot for the Steelers season this year could be, if we're looking at the schedule, to answer RJ question, is right after the bye week on the road against the Rams, playing a Rams team that I'm not sure what their identity is right now, because they're 2 years removed from their Super Bowl championship run. How healthy will they be? They're missing pieces from previous years. I don't think they're going to be the Super Bowl threat that they were 2 years ago. I think that Sean McVay's kind of I think they're dealing with the impact of spending all the money that they did in free agency and making the trades that they did to kind of win and be in the win now mode, and they're coming down from that. Then you play a Jaguars team that, yeah, sure, you're excited about the Jaguars with Trevor Lawrence and Travis Etienne, but I think they're a team that, just like the Steelers, they're up and coming and they're trying to prove something. Then you play a Titans team that, who knows what they're trying to do at quarterback right now. Ryan Tannehill got, has clearly 2 successors behind him, and Will Levis and Malik Willis. That's a different situation. And you got the Packers, again, with Jordan Love, a quarterback that we need to see how he's going to play for the Packers this year. And all of this can change with how good teams actually are this year. There's always those teams that you don't expect to be really good, and then it turns out they are really good, and then their games on the schedule that you looked at back in August and you said, oh man, that's an easy dub, and now you're looking like, oh wait a second, that's actually a really tough game for the Steelers. But again, I'm looking at that middle stretch here. Let's say again that let's give them 3 wins in their first 5 games that they pull off in those first 5 games. If they're able to come through that next week, 4-week stretch after the bye week with another 3 wins, you're looking at 6-3 in a decent position there heading into the second half of the season. And then it could be a matter of win 4 out of your last 8 games, and you have a 10-win season, and that might get you to the playoffs in the AFC this year, because as much as people are talking about how good the AFC is and this, that, and the third, these teams are going to beat up on each other. I don't think there's going to be like 5 13-win teams. I think there's going to be like 2 or 3 that could have 12 plus wins, but I think there's going to be a lot of teams with 10-9 wins that are hovering around there. And if the Steelers can do enough damage to some of those teams on their schedule, like the Ravens, like the Jaguars, like the Titans, I think they could put themselves in a position where they're playing themselves into a strong playoff wild card position, and maybe even competing for the division if the Bengals maybe have an off year a little bit there. So all that being said, if I'm picking a sweet spot of the schedule to expect maybe the Steelers to build something up, it's right after the bye week for the next 4 games, lining up those opponents, 3 of those games at home, and one of those games coming off a Thursday night football game, so to get them more rested to play the Packers at home there. But one thing that I always tell people, you can never tell how tough a schedule is in, what month is it? May. And you can't even really tell that in August or even really September sometimes. So we'll see how that plays out. But we thank RJ, and we thank all of our callers who called in with questions. And we still have quite a few more that I could get to on the show, but we'll save those questions for another episode. Thanks again to everyone who checked out the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Carter Critiques. You can also read my work at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and check out our podcasts over there at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, post-gazette.com, as well as the North Shore Drive podcast for that. But if you want to find me every day here on Locked On Steelers, just search Locked On Steelers. You can find me on your favorite podcasting app and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to this YouTube channel for all your daily Monday through Friday episodes. I'll be back Tuesday with more talk on your Pittsburgh Steelers, giving you a pre-look at what OTAs is going to be like this year, because they start Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of this week. It's going to be an exciting lineup to see the guys back on the field and working together. Again, we'll get to that later this week. I'm your host, Chris Carter. We'll see you then here on the Locked On Steelers podcast.